We usually think of Buddhism as this path to peace, right? All about enlightenment and compassion. But today, we're going to look at a much, much darker side of that story. The really troubling relationship between Japanese Buddhism and the rise of the nation's military empire back in the 20th century. So the big question is, how on earth did a religion of peace get so tangled up with a doctrine of war and conquest? So picture this, it's 1905, and Japan has just done the unthinkable. It defeated Russia in a major war, and the whole world is stunned. Everyone's asking, how did this small island nation pull that off? Well, influential Zen masters like Shaku Soen had an answer. And it wasn't about better ships or guns. No, he said it was spiritual. It was the samurai spirit. This was the very beginning of a really powerful and dangerous new national story. All right, so here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with how that samurai spirit got a modern-day makeover. Then we'll look at how it was baked into an official Buddhism for the empire. We'll also shine a light on the few who dared to resist, and then dive into the chilling philosophy of the Zen warrior. And finally, see how all this ended up in the mind of the average soldier. Okay, first up, the samurai spirit reborn. Our story really kicks off as Japan is becoming a major world power, annexing Korea in 1910, flexing its muscles. The whole country was filled with this new kind of aggressive energy, and it was looking for a spiritual backbone to justify its big ambitions. So you've got thinkers like Nukuya Kaiten who start arguing that Zen is actually the perfect religion for a nation that's on the rise. He claimed that every single citizen, not just soldiers, but you, me, everyone, should basically become a samurai, brave, loyal, and most importantly, ready to sacrifice themselves. Bushido wasn't some dusty old code anymore. It was being polished up and sold as the new creed for a modern nationalist Japan. And this whole idea got a name, Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan. Now, it was a mix of different traditions, but the Zen master Shaku Soen was smart. He zeroed in on the key Buddhist contribution, this idea of giving up your small self to serve a greater cause. And that greater cause, well, it was about to get very specific. And boom, there it is, laid out plain and simple. That spiritual idea of self-sacrifice wasn't about reaching enlightenment anymore. It was being aimed like a weapon, directly at service to the state and total, unquestioning loyalty to the emperor. The line between your spiritual duty and your national duty, it was being completely erased. So, let's see how this goes from just being a powerful idea to becoming official policy. Because these concepts didn't just hang in the air. They were forged into a state-approved ideology, one designed for one thing: total obedience. This is probably the most important concept to grasp. It's called Imperial Way Buddhism. And you have to get this. It wasn't some brand new thing. It was just the final logical step. The official doctrine became that the law of the Buddha is less important than the law of the emperor. So if your faith tells you one thing, but the state tells you another, the state wins every single time. And how do you sell an idea like that? Well, you dig back through history. Proponents pulled out this ancient constitution from the 7th century to argue that the emperor wasn't just a leader, he was divine, and his orders couldn't be questioned. This wasn't just politics. They framed it as the sacred, cosmic order of the universe. Heaven gives the orders, and the earth just has to obey. And here's the really wild part. They actually turned this into a point of nationalist pride. Major figures were arguing that what made Japanese Buddhism superior to all other forms of Buddhism was this total fusion with the state. Its complete obedience was presented as its greatest strength, the very thing that made it special. Okay, but there's a huge problem, right? What about the #1 rule in Buddhism, do not take life? How do you get around that? Simple, you just redefine it. War, they said, wasn't killing. It was a compassionate act. They took this old phrase, isatsu tasho, killing one in order that many may live, and twisted it to justify mass slaughter. Suddenly, violence for the empire wasn't a sin. It was a kind and necessary act. But, and this is so important, not everyone bought into this. There was resistance. There were prophetic voices that spoke out against this terrible merger of faith and fascism, even when they knew how incredibly dangerous it was. I mean, just listen to this. All the way back in 1921, this high-ranking Buddhist leader, Otani Sonyu, puts out this powerful warning. He saw exactly where this was all going. He's basically saying that if the state asks you to do something unjust, your first duty is to your own conscience, not to the state. I mean, what a courageous thing to say at that time. And the resistance got organized. A group called the Youth League for Revitalizing Buddhism popped up. And these were mainly young, passionate, ordinary people, not priests. They looked at the official Buddhist institutions and saw them as a religious opiate, just drugging the people into submission. They wanted a Buddhism that was active, that fought for justice. This was their rallying cry, and it's just so powerful. Carry the Buddha on your backs and go out into the streets. It's a complete rejection of just sitting quietly in a temple. It's a demand for action. For them, faith meant getting your hands dirty and bringing compassion and justice to people who are actually suffering. And you can guess what happened next. The state's response was swift and absolutely brutal. First, their newspaper was censored. Then the league was kicked out of the National Federation. Then their chairman was arrested and beaten. And finally, in 1937, the hammer fell. Over 200 members were arrested, and the movement was completely, utterly eradicated. It just goes to show you the price of dissent. All right, now we need to talk about what is maybe the most shocking part of this story, especially for people in the West. And it involves a name you might even recognize. D.T. Suzuki, the man who is largely credited with introducing Zen to the Western world. So Suzuki and others pushed this idea that Zen and the way of the warrior were basically the same thing. They argued Zen wasn't just a religion. It was more like a spiritual technology. It was a tool that could be used to create the perfect soldier, one who could kill without hesitation, without fear, without any moral struggle at all. And you don't have to take my word for it. Listen to Suzuki himself. He says Zen can be wedded to any ideology, fascism, democracy, whatever. He's essentially arguing that Zen has no built-in morality. It's just a powerful tool. And that kind of thinking is exactly what opened the door for a military state to pick it up and use it for its own ends. So this is his chilling rationalization for killing. It's a four-step process he called the sword that gives life. First, the enemy brings it on himself. He makes himself a victim. Second, the soldier isn't the one doing the killing, it's the sword acting on its own. Third, the sword is just an instrument of justice. And fourth, this act of justice is actually an act of mercy. It's this incredible mental gymnastics designed to completely absolve the soldier of any moral responsibility. And this is where that twisted logic ultimately leads. The soldier, now free of self and guilt, doesn't just kill. No, he becomes an artist of the first grade. The act of taking a human life is reframed as a beautiful, creative act. It is the absolute, ultimate spiritualization of violence. Okay, so you have these really complex, abstract philosophies. How did they actually get into the heads of the average soldiers on the ground? That's the final, crucial step, turning this heady doctrine into simple, easy-to-follow dogma. It happens with things like this. This is a quote from the official military code that every soldier had to memorize. Just listen to the phrases: transcending life and death, find joy in living in eternal duty. That's not military speak. That is the language of Zen and Bushido, completely weaponized. It's D.T. Suzuki's philosophy boiled down into a direct command. Your life and death are meaningless. All that matters is your duty. And that's where we'll leave it, with this question. This whole story is a really powerful, sobering warning about what can happen when any religion becomes a servant to national ambition. When a spiritual path that promises to save your soul starts demanding your absolute obedience to the state above all else, you have to stop and ask, who or what is actually being saved?